Good afternoon. Welcome back to the third year of the Shifley Lectures, which are enabled by the class of 1950 and are named after Vice Admiral and his wife, Frances Shifley. This series, this semester, focuses primarily on Naval Institute authors, and the reason why is because we have a new exhibit opening tomorrow to the public called Warrior Writers, U.S. Naval Institute, which shows the history of naval thought mostly from a junior officer perspective from 1873 until today. So we hope you have a chance to see that. And for everybody who's going to be watching this on Facebook later on, we hope you can join us as well. In 2007, I was teaching in the political science department, and I ran a little panel one night over at Mitchell Hall, and it was called Warrior Writers. And I asked three junior officers, one of whom was still on active duty at the time, Captain Craig Mullaney, who had written The Unforgiving Minute, Nate Fick, who had been a Marine Corps captain in Iraq and Afghanistan, who wrote One Bullet Away, and a third junior officer, Marine, 1998 class of Naval Academy, Dave Danelo. What was extraordinary that night was that it filled. And for those of you who know Mitchell Hall, that's no mean feat when you're not requiring NIDS to be somewhere. They were there to listen and learn about the art and practice of writing from a junior officer, a former junior officer perspective. And something resonated that night. And so that's why we're running this Warrior Writer program this semester. Dave Danelo, in addition to being a tremendous all-around guy, a good friend, Dave is one of the writers today whom I respect the most. In fact, you know you're reading a good book when you're marking it up all over the place. Dave is one of the most thoughtful authors. He's been there and done that, as they say, in his book Blood Stripes on the Marines in Iraq, on the border, where he literally went on both sides of the U.S. and the Mexican border to study the issue in depth, and now with the return. Dave is one of the few junior officers. I can't think. Are you still a junior officer? Not anymore.
Is that once a junior officer, always junior officer?
Where in his book you'll read quotes by Cicero, John Stuart Mill, Aristotle, and mixed in with, I think there was a Star Trek reference, or at least I can't remember if it was. If it wasn't, it will be in the next one. So, 1998 Naval Academy graduate Dave Danelo.
Thanks so much, Claude. Appreciate it. Thanks to Claude Berube, who's put on a terrific exhibit that'll be a really exciting thing for everyone to see, and also to his staff that I know coordinated it as well. Thanks to the class of 1950 for providing this opportunity. There's a certain paradox of a returning graduate from an institution like the Naval Academy that has a resonance beyond its own existence. And the paradox is that there's a certain need to conform to institutional norms in whatever it is that you say, to understand the core values, and to also understand chow calls and cannonballs and whatever food is consumed in King Hall these days, and to know that it's consumed in King Hall. But then on the other side, and as many of the warrior writers that are exhibited in the room right downstairs, there's also a driving expectation to sort of challenge the norm of the institution. Let us dare to read, speak, think, and write, as John Adams quote, and as Admiral Stavridis said, to blog as well. Those who do read, speak, think, and write, and blog are expected to say something that pushes against the norm a little bit. And that's not always an easy balance to strike. Some people go a little bit too far in a brazen challenge, and other times we can maybe not push enough. People have asked me why I wrote The Return. It's my third book. The subtitle is A Field Manual for Life After Combat, but it's actually really the opposite of a field manual. It's not a how-to book, because coming back from a combat environment or transitioning, or what I call returning from a military environment or military experience, isn't really something that you have a how-to guide for. There's no textbook for it. There's no field manual really for it. And that's the thesis that I put forward. For me, it was different than previous other books or previous other works because it was the most personal. I really had to pull 10 years of my own experience and take a hard look at it and say, what is true about this, and then submit something for the general public and say, this was true for me. Hopefully this works for you. I've been grateful that in the 10 months since the book's come out, it's resonated with a pretty broad spectrum. The American Red Cross actually took 2,000 copies and has put it in all 50 chapters of all 50 states. And so that's been a positive affirmation. And I just alluded to something. There's a difference in my mind. We talk a lot about transitions, and I'm just going to kind of jump into some of the content and themes that are in the book. And then our room right now is personal enough that we can have a little bit of a conversation about it. For me, there's a big difference between the idea of transitioning and the idea of returning. Transitioning is structural. Transitioning is what people talk about when they say that we need more programs to help returning veterans. We need more material resources to be able to connect someone from the military into a civilian environment or into a civilian life. We need to teach people how to write resumes. We need to teach folks how to use LinkedIn or other social media. We need to teach tools to get somewhere. But returning is a completely different experience, and I think it's one that's discussed less and one that our society is less equipped to have a conversation about for a number of different reasons. Returning is a spiritual process. Returning is the idea that you have just as much meaning and purpose in a civilian identity as you do in a military one. And for a combat veteran, that can be a difficult thing to get to. Why is it difficult to get to? Why is it hard for a combat veteran to find that place where they can return? Well, it's because the first thing that a combat veteran faces when they get out of the military is this condition called exile. And exile is completely different from post-traumatic stress disorder, a term that's overused and misinterpreted and not entirely useful in a conversation about what it means to return from combat. Exile is a sense of not knowing where you belong. Exile is a sense of, well, you know, when I was over there, I wanted to be here, but now that I'm here, I want to be back over there, because over there my life made sense. Over there, I had meaning, I had value, I had not only intimate relationships that depended on me with their life that I exchanged and traded and gave mine for, but I also had a certain sense of euphoria that I felt. There's a sixth sense about being in combat that those of you in the room that have been there have developed that can't be replaced in any other environment. And the way that you feel when you achieve a certain harmonic balance in that environment and then try to come back to this one is very similar, in my understanding. I've never been an Olympic athlete. I don't know if anybody here has. If you have, let me know. But from what I understand, Olympic athletes, when they win a gold medal and then retire from their sport, go through a deep depression. Presidents have described this when leaving office. If you've studied and talked to any presidents from in the 20th century, certainly, that we've been able to talk with about this, when they leave office, they just don't know where they belong anymore, because you have climbed the pinnacle of what it was. If you're an Olympic athlete, you've trained for years or decades to get to this point where you are. And then suddenly, you're done. You're gone, and you're never going to go back there again. That process is a deeper process than a transition can get to, which is why I talk about returning. And I talk about returning from exile through the lens of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. It's a mythical template that, has anybody here studied this just by a show of hands? A few have. Joseph Campbell wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and the idea was that meaningful events in our life involve some sort of call to adventure and then a powerful experience and then returning from that experience in a way that we're trying to make sense of. And the way that we're trying to make sense of it isn't what everybody tunes in to watch. It's not the nobody flips on the TV to watch Han Solo brewing morning coffee or Luke Skywalker just sitting there standing around the campfire, or the hobbits going back and forth from the grocery store. That's not exciting. There's nothing cool about that. That's not what what draws us or what captivates us, but that's our lives. And that initial stage of a warrior's return into exile is something that every warrior goes through. It's something that every combat veteran who comes into a civilian life and leaves the uniform behind permanently and leaves that warrior identity behind as an ongoing part of their life is going to go through. And not every form looks the same. It's prescriptive and it's individual, and it varies from person to person in the same way that a combat experience varies from person to person. People have asked if there are civilian analogies that can help, because not all of us are Olympic athletes, of course. But all of us have had meaningful experiences in our lives that we've sought to make sense of, whether they were civilian events or military events. Making sense of that, and the way that I write about making sense of that, and kind of the step 2 of this process of returning, is what I call an appreciation for duality. I think understanding duality and paradox is a key step in overcoming exile. And the reason why is because the goal of what we're trying to get to is a coexistence in our mind of two opposite worlds. And there's no two more opposite experiences that a human being can endure than living in a combat environment and then moving and living in a peaceful environment for the remainder of your days. Those two experiences are powerful, and those two experiences are opposite. And what really happens in the process of returning, especially to veterans who have deployed 5, 6, 7, 8, the personal record I know of is 13 times. I know a Special Forces officer who's deployed 13 times since September 11th, is that you put yourself in this constant state of toggling between a day at the office where you're doing a raid and then coming back into a civilian identity where you're cooking dinner and playing with the kids and living your life. In Nellis Air Force Base, veterans of drone combat have described the same paradoxical experience where they're asked to put steel on target in one moment and then 12 hours later come back and change diapers. And that mental space, finding the capacity to have a safe identity in experiences that are so polar and so opposite is key to returning, but it's key first to understanding what it means to return and understanding that acceptance of duality. The second part of the book, I talk a lot about duality, and I share what my own observations are of the differences and the paradoxes between war and peace, and that war can be both beautiful and terrible at the same time, and peace can be both safe and empty at the same time, and that conflict challenges us both inside ourselves and in our daily lives, and at the same time, we all need a space that we can crawl back to that's protected from the mortars and the artillery rounds that can rain down on us. So, is it possible to master opposite worlds? Is it possible to develop that sense of mastery? To me, that is the core challenge of returning, as distinct from transitioning. And when I look at people, many of the warrior riders who have been exhibited here in Preble Hall, they moved the naval service beyond its own existence, but they also moved themselves in their post-military identities, or perhaps not even in a military identity at all, in a different way. That is a challenge that we live, that those who have attended the Naval Academy have lived on a day-in, day-out basis, of even toggling into a space for the time on liberty and then coming back into to Mother B. To me, one of the ways that we can do this, and one of the ways that we can talk about this as a society, so I want to get in and I want to close a little bit with how we would change the language of talking about our relationship in a military experience with society as civilians. Many of you are here in uniform, some of you are here not in, or many of you are here having been in uniform, and some are here not in uniform at all, or not having been. There's two things that I advocate as a shift. The first is that there needs to be a distinction that we make in society between post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic stress asset. Because not everybody has post-traumatic stress disorder. Many people have exile. And often, exile, in its varying forms, is prescribed in the extreme by a therapist or a counselor or a concerned parent or spouse as post-traumatic stress disorder, when it's really not. Which is not to say post-traumatic stress disorder does not exist. It's not to say post-traumatic stress disorder isn't real, or traumatic brain injury isn't real, or those are not experiences that combat veterans have that they need, that we all need to be able to talk through. But oftentimes that post-traumatic stress can be an experience that we draw on in our lives in a meaningful way for things that we go on to make choices for and for the work that we go on to do. The best thing that I can do is just to describe my own work. I was talking with Drexel King before, and he's a captain back there in the room, and he was asking me, 10th Company Officer, 2-4 veteran, Marine. And he said, "What do you do now?" And I said, "Well, I get paid to travel and write." And I said, and he kind of looked at me and said, "You can't do that." And I said, "Well, that's what I've invented." For me, the capacity of being a warrior and the capacity to move forward in life with courage, I drew on that to invent a career for myself as a solo entrepreneur. For the past 10 years and some change, I've been a writer, I've been a researcher, and I've become a border expert as well, because borders are where interesting things happen. Borders are the crossing points of humanity and where the friction points of civilization butt up against themselves. It's sort of applied geopolitics, maybe, if you're a physicist. That's how I live, and that's what I do. And it's an exciting life, and it's a lot of fun, and it's not something that would suit everybody. But it suits me because I decided, I chose to take my combat experience, the things that I had learned, and apply them in this direction. I can't tell any other warrior how they will choose their identity as a civilian. But I can tell them that, like Cincinnatus, if they don't come back and find their farm and find the olive grove and the wine branches that give them meaning and purpose and value and a sense of power in their lives, that it won't work. Which brings me to my second point. One of the shibboleths or societal rituals that's happened in our society is that we begin to thank everybody for their service. It's become this kind of genuflecting ritual that civilians do immediately when encountering a veteran. Thank you for your service. And it's certainly better than the alternative of, how dare you serve in the military or being spit upon or anything like that. I wouldn't want that to happen, and I wouldn't want our society to relate that way. But what thank you for your service has turned into is sort of a closure on conversation. Well, okay, thank you for your service. Well, that doesn't make me better than you. You're a citizen. Your votes send me into wherever it is that I go upon serving our country. What's your identity? What are you doing? And then why did I choose to serve? Why did I choose to volunteer? Service is something that gives as much meaning to those who are serving as to society in general. And when I say I'd like thank you for your service to change, I'm not saying that I don't want to be thanked for my service or that I don't think that it's healthy for society. I don't think it's healthy to close the conversation right there. I don't think it's healthy that we hold veterans on a pedestal to the extent that we can't relate to them once they are no longer veterans, because what that does to a veteran is it diminishes their identity once they leave the service. Oh, now I'm just a nasty civilian again. That's not healthy for anybody. So those are two things that I would like the conversation to change, because I would like for us to be able to say that we could draw as much, and I'm speaking in a we sense to those of you who are combat veterans in the room. I know there's a few, or particularly as well for those of you who are military veterans. I'd like for those of us who have had a military or combat experience to be able to feel good about it, feel proud of it, but not be wrapped up in it. and draw just as much meaning and purpose from, in my case, roaming around on borders, or in your case, being a neuroscientist, or a doctor, or a cybersecurity expert, or a teacher, or a contract specialist, or an English expert. That's what I'd like to see. That's how I'd like our conversation about returning to go. And so I'm grateful to have had the chance to talk about returning, and would encourage those of you who are on it to, on that journey, to show us what you got and make it an exciting one. Thanks for having me here, and thanks for giving me a chance to speak, and I think we've got time for some questions.
I find your concept of exile very interesting, but I don't really understand what it means. For me, exile implies exile from something. You can expand a little bit on what, just to flesh that out a bit as to what exile means for you here.
That's a good question. I'm not sure purgatory would have worked in the same context. But perhaps that might be one analogy to draw or to create in understanding what exile, the structure of it or the sense of it. The emotion would be just feeling as though you don't belong anywhere. Feeling as though this is a reason why Joseph Campbell used to describe the return, well, he still does, it's in his book, as the first step that a hero does when attempting to return is refusing to return. And so there's a sense of, this is why so many veterans go back into security as a profession. Because, I mean, you can make a lot of money doing that, and it's a safe space, and it's an identity that you understand, because the battlefield makes sense, because combat makes sense, and you are good at it. And that sense of being in exile, that feeling of needing to go somewhere where adrenaline might be the wrong word, but where you are in a space that you understand your identity, and that part of your identity that is a warrior identity that's always with you, that will always need to find a safe space, can be used in some productive way. Not knowing what to do with that is a condition I still wake up with. I don't think that changes. I think it's a process that you go through every day, and at the same time, or at least that I've gone through every day. And those, just by a show of hands, how many are either military veterans or combat veterans in the room? Those who have had that experience, who have read the book, many have affirmed to me that they have gone through the same thing, although I would hate to speak for them. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
So there's been at least in the past couple of years, there's been a lot of attention put on veterans and the struggle that they go through to return back to civilian society. And I've noticed, at least with my friends anyways, that a lot of them can't or won't ask for help when they need it. And I think that's just a military, viewpoint. What would you suggest? I know that in your book you mentioned like you don't advocate therapy or anything, or if they don't feel comfortable going for therapy, what would you suggest to
I should make a clarification rather than I do not know if therapy is always prescriptive.
Right.
In many cases, I have had conversations with many of my former Marines who have found, or many Marines who I have known who have gone into therapy, who have found therapy in the past, and I would just say in the past 5 to 10 years, to be harmful to their own capacity. And their growth occurred actually when they kind of left with the program. Some of that, and this is, I'll caveat this with, I'm not a psychiatrist, there's kind of the lawyer asterisk that I'm going to put there. There's a couple of different forms of therapy that are used in in psychiatry and in psychology that involve going back and reliving the experience and talking about it and kind of going back into a painful space to go through it over and over again to get to a new point for it, with it. That works for some people. That doesn't work for other people, particularly if they don't trust the person whom they're talking to with that information. I think the idea of getting help from a medical professional also needs to be caveated with a sense of being able to talk about something or an experience that's changed you within a small community, which may be only 1 or 2 people. Again, I'll just share from my own experience. April 6, 2004, I was wounded in Iraq in a mortar attack. Left with shrapnel in my jaw. It happens. Doesn't make me bad or worse. It's a kind of incident and it's an environmental hazard of the profession that I was in. But there were 2 other people who were wounded as well in the same attack. We call each other every year. We have a conversation. And every year I learn something new about what they think happened and what I think happened. And it's I mean, it's really interesting because we still tell each other things that we felt and saw and observed that we just end up remembering. Whatever key moments occur in a combat deployment or in a military experience that you have, being able to talk with somebody else about that is a observed data point from what I've seen in the past decade and some change that kind of helps keep that experience in a safe place. That is the answer I would give to your question in terms of really sharp, intense combat experiences. There's, I think, a separate issue in terms of figuring out what to do with your life. And that's kind of a lot of what I talk about in the book. I don't think that therapy can teach you what to do with your life. I think that is something that comes from within and that we must pull from inside each of us, from the hardware that we've got. Does that answer the question a little bit? Sir?
What lessons from your experience in the war do you feel are important to communicate to those who have not had your experience and to those who make decisions to send people out to a hard way?
Well, that's a great question. The first, I'm going to pull from the book a little bit. I'm going through I'm kind of flipping through the pages in my mind to answer your question. The first is geography. I think there is an emotional resonance with a place like Fallujah or Ramadi or Kandahar or Helmand, or that anybody who's been there and who has either shed their blood or held the shed blood of others feels, and understanding that geography is meaningful. Just I don't want to say most, but it becomes difficult to have a conversation with somebody if they don't either know or care where Fallujah is, where a place is, where a people are that you experienced. That's one lesson. Being able to appreciate and understand those things is important, which is less common, as I've found, than I had hoped. Perhaps the second lesson in my own experiences is the human one. Understanding that it's flesh and blood that interacts with flesh and blood on the ground, and whether we choose to or not choose to engage in a combat environment for any number of political or policy reasons, it ultimately comes back to a profound human experience that is more life and death than anything else than we've witnessed, other than a natural disaster, I suppose. Perhaps it would be helpful if more people held political office who had somebody close in their lives who had a similar experience. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
You've got a lot more opportunities to have conversations like this across the board than I have. So I tend to stew in my own box of ideas. One of them that sort of connects with the last point that you made about thank you for your service. That phrase or that phenomenon seems to me to condense one of the, or to symbolize the role that the American military has come to play in culture, right? Basic, which is new American militarism talks about this, that we invoke the military sort of intuitively, mentally, emotionally when we need to feel secure about things, and we sort of need to believe its omnipotence. So it has kind of a God role. It has a, institutionally, it seems to suggest moral coherence in a world where it's difficult to have moral conversations that don't become personal really quickly. And then it seems to assure us that there's some civic virtue or some so a place of kind of classical Republican civic virtues sort of resides in the way that we want it to. And I'm wondering if that clipping off of conversational space by saying thank you for your service isn't kind of for many at a root level or emotional level
an affirmation
of a need for
right.
the veteran not to transition, or the veteran not to return.
Right. We want you on that wall. We need you on that wall.
Well, right, in a way. And I wonder
right.
if that's something is that just a high-flown thought, or is that something that resonates as a plausible?
I have, for those viewing on YouTube and Facebook, I have to comment, Tim Feist is, who just enlightened me with his question, is a classmate, dear friend, and one of the smartest people I know. And what he shared, to capture it on audio, is the idea that thank you for your service is something that's as important for society to say, because the military is held in such high esteem, because it's repeatedly ranked the institution that the public has the most confidence in. So by saying thank you for your service to anybody who's a veteran, it's a way that society is trying to affirm the authority of something, or affirm the value, to make sense of the order of society. I don't know. What I do think is that there's everybody says it for different reasons now, but it has become a social ritual to say, in a way that's puzzled me, and I think perhaps puzzled most of us who came into the military in our generation in the 1990s, where it was neither a good nor a bad thing that you chose to do, but it was a little bit of a countercultural choice. For me, when I left for the Naval Academy in June of 1994, it was kind of like, wow, that's interesting. Like, that's not bad. It's kind of cool, but it's not what most people do. But you go do that, and there's some people do the Peace Corps, some people do Teach for America, and you're gonna do your thing, your warrior thing. That's okay. And because society has such low confidence in any other public institution, I do think that there's a certain thing that plays out when people get thanked for their service of, wow, yeah, you must be great, and I feel good about being American now because I'm thanking you for serving. Maybe I think that that'd be a little bit useful thing to expand on too, because I guess I'd like to see whatever it is that we're putting tax dollars into, drawing as much social connectivity, perhaps, as war making.
I've read your book, as you know, and I'm glad you spoke about the Olympic athlete and the presidents that go into depression. And those analogies really speak to people that have a sense of accomplishment Whether or not they actually accomplish anything is besides the point, but they come back with a sense of accomplishment that is now lacking, right? And
Right.
that's the part of the definition of exile. But I would guess that that's not a very common experience of people coming back, to have that feeling or that you said the euphoria of accomplishing something as big as a gold medal or being president of the United States. That's a very exclusive club. So how does your book speak to the people, I think the vast majority, who don't have that sense of great accomplishment, but yet still feel like they're in your exile, your definition of exile?
That's an excellent question.
Did you write for a very narrow audience, or how would you address the larger?
I would disagree slightly in this particular context. There is a moment that every combat veteran that I have spoken to, that I have been friends with or know, can go back to in their experience of being in combat as that sense of accomplishment, as that thing. That doesn't mean, and I don't know whether this is the majority or the minority. I don't know enough to quantify it, because everybody comes back with feelings about their combat experience as a whole as to whether it was positive or negative. But that's a big part of it, is that if you come back and you're like, I know a military veteran who burned his uniforms as soon as they left the service. It was just like, I got to get away from that. Or who gave them all away, or who shuns that military identity as much as possible, or as deeply as possible, just because there's darkness and pain and failure associated with that in their own mind. Failure as a human, failure as a warrior, perhaps. Those who have gone through that experience, that's true. I'm not sure that they feel exile in the same way. I think that there is some deeper trauma that goes on there, and I think that there is a deeper sense of not just not knowing how to where to belong, but how to deal with whatever they felt insufficient about what they went through in the military. I will say that I've had more people. Again, I've never met a combat veteran who did not have some moment of a euphoria or a sense of triumph over something that didn't come back drawing upon that, and drawing upon that as being a meaningful and powerful moment. And those are moments that they're usually very, very reluctant to talk about or open up with anybody, even other combat veterans, anybody who was not actually there. That may not answer your question, but hopefully it expands on it a little.
Thank you. Time for one more quick question.
I really like the idea of the exile and the duality, because I feel like that can even apply to, a minority at the academy, African American or female, just trying to identify and explain that sense of belonging in one state. When you go back home, it's completely, even for academy guys, you go home, you just can't explain the academy to yourself. Do you go to school on a ship? What do you do? So I think it's important, but when it comes to, molding these midshipmen, right, everybody in here is probably searching for meaning and purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Have you found a group that's more successful, sort of grounding in that meaning and purpose?
The consistent theme that I've found, Claude Berube mentioned Nate Fick, and other warriors who have gone on to do something else. The consistent theme I've found, Drexel, is that there is a deep sense of satisfaction in some civilian pursuit, whether that's cooking or parenting or writing or designing systems or medicine or affirming social law or anything, or there is a deep sense of purpose and value in something that has nothing to do with combat, in something that is external to the warrior life. that, and this kind of brings us full circle, that is part of what we think about in an archetype of a warrior writer. We think about this, the warrior poets, right? The idea that you affirm your martial identity and then also affirm a soft identity that is the yin that balances the yang. That is the consistent theme in those whom I've seen who form that group of individuals who've returned.
Dave, thank you very much.
Thanks, Todd.
Again, please help spread the word about the Warrior Writer exhibit that opens tomorrow through January 31st. I should also mention, when you do see the logo for Warrior Writers, on the left-hand side you'll see very young midshipman, I think it was Nimitz. We had Nimitz there. And on the right, you'll see Marine on the radio, and that is Captain Dave Danelo. So again, thanks for letting us use your image. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Clyde. Appreciate it.